Okay, so the question always becomes, why are we doing full range of motion lifts? And it's always this big debate, like, why throwers are always only in that quarter squat position. They shouldn't be training in that full range of motion. And at Garage Strength and at Throws U, we do train in the full range of motion, especially when we're doing Olympic lifts. We will do full range of motion movements off the floor. We'll catch snatches all the way down in the hole. We'll catch cleans all the way down in the hole. We'll do front squats, ass to grass. We'll do back squats, ass to grass. And the question is always like, why does that carry over? And I think that to start this whole answer is that, one, I don't not use partial movements in our system. We do use partial movements. We use partial lifts quite a bit. We'll do power snatches off boxes. We'll do power cleans off boxes. We'll do power snatches from the floor. We'll do high hang snatch into the hole, but you're only doing a pull from the hip. So we do use partial movements in that regard. But why, my first explanation is going to be, why do we use the full range of motion movements? And to start, full range of motion movements, especially when we're doing snatches deep in the hole, we're doing cleans deep in the hole, we're going to create more hip mobility, we're going to create more trunk stability, and if we're snatching, we're going to create more thoracic stability overhead. And that stability overhead with the thoracic spine and the more trunk activation that we can get when we're catching and absorbing the force of a clean, and we learn how to decelerate that load, that can then be carried over into the circle as well, because you're going to be recruiting your glutes a little bit more. You're going to be able to hit deeper positions, so our hips are going to start to open up. And I would like to use one of my athletes, Rachel Fatherly, who came to me and she could not even do a snatch past this position. She was so tight in her hips that she could not extend her hips here. She couldn't make contact with the bar. She could not pull a snatch from the floor, make contact, and then catch it and go into the hole. And it took us about 6 months, 8 months, and now we're 2.5 years in, and now she can catch 80 plus kilos ass to grass. She can catch 100 kilos of the clean ass to grass, and she has much better stability. She has much better force absorption, and she can control her speed now in the shot circle when she's throwing. So that's sort of the first answer. And then on top of that, if you start to study when muscles lengthen, and if you're in a full squat, when the muscle lengthens, your Golgi tendon organ will signal to recruit more motor units. So we can always think lengthening is strengthening. So the longer our muscles get, the more motor units they will recruit in the lift, and the more motor units that they can recruit, the more they'll start to bring in even satellite cells, and then those satellite cells can then become permanent motor units that are always going to be recruited at high speeds. So if we can start to train the body to recruit a ton of high threshold motor units at these high speeds, again, those units are going to be recruited when we're throwing at high speeds, and that's going to help decelerate at the front of the circle. And I'll use Ryan Negevin as an example, because he would always sit there and be, why are we doing full snatches? Why are we doing full cleans? And he could get a video where he's doing box squats with 550, just doing crazy amount of box squats, but he could not catch 70 kilos in the hole of a snatch and be stable overhead. And it showed in his finish in the distance, because he would just jump out of those finishes instead of controlling and staying grounded that entire time at the front of the circle. So he would struggle to decelerate the implement. And so again, that all factors into why we use the full range of motion movements. And then finally, if we can go into, you're going to have greater glute activation. This is science, and you cannot disprove this, but when you do a full range of motion back squat or front squat, you will get greater glute activation than if you're doing a partial range of motion front squat or back squat. Now, how does that factor in? The glute maximus and the glute med are most important when you're decelerating. If you're a right-handed thrower at the front of the circle, using your butt to decelerate is important when that left leg is grounding at the front, and that's where having a strong ass factors into a really good throw. This is where we can cut to Sam's giant butt.
Look at that booty.
So that's another factor. Then finally, science will show us that if we're studying counter movement jumps, so vertical leaps, Now, vertical leap is done from exactly where we're going to be when we're throwing, just from here, like a quarter squat, right? Counter movement jumps improve more when training that full range of motion than they do when training just the partial lifts. But that counter movement jump is the best when training partial lifts and full range of motion lifts. So in our system, we will train partial lifts, we will train full range of motion lifts. It's not just about full range, but if you can think about, you know, all the world's best powerlifters, these guys can barely walk around. They can barely move. They can barely put a shot in their head because they don't have the mobility. Their muscles are shortened. They're not lengthened. Now think about an Olympic weightlifter. Think about someone like Norik Vardanian or Harrison Morrison. These guys are long and loose and super, super powerful. And I'll share an example. Norik Vardanian had never picked up a shot. He picked up a 16-pound shot and he threw it 15 meters. Why? Because he was super explosive, his muscles were long, and he knew how to activate high threshold motor units better than anyone I've ever seen who had never picked up a shot, okay? So that's a couple different factors as to why we're training in that full range of motion. And then once, over the span of a year, our body will adapt to training the full range of motion. Then once we get to the peaking season, we'll really start to use 2-box snatches, 2-box power cleans. We might do quarter squat and jumps supersetted with full range of motion squats. But going down to that partial range of motion, when we're starting to peak, will enable our body to have a much greater adaptation period and fully recover from the whole year of training so that our peaks are even greater. And that's going to show, you know, look at what we did last year at US Nationals. We took 4 people to US Nationals, 3 of them made the top 8. So that all factors into what we're thinking about when we're designing the program. And then finally, if we can just touch a little bit on the glide, if you look at a thrower coming out of the back of the circle in the glide, they are going to get into that full range of motion. And that's where it is very important that they learn how to do single leg squats so that they can be really strong out of the back of the circle. They're strong unilaterally. But a glider will use a stretch reflex where they drop when they're loading and they drop. That's all stretch reflex. And that stretch reflex, the stretch shortening cycle, is going to be learned when they're doing Olympic lifts very easily. So, you know, that's all part of what we do. But on top of that, you know, everybody will say this, and it's like, okay, this all transfers over. If we could talk about someone like Sam Mattis, who's trained in this system for a while, or Rachel, who's trained in this system, or Mo Riddick, who's trained in the system where we do full range of motion stuff. You know, Sam didn't deadlift for over a year and a half, and he PR'd his deadlift by, it was like 80 pounds. He pulled almost 700 pounds. Well, why? It's a transfer of training. That's the final factor here, is that if I can have an athlete that can pull from the floor, doing cleans from the floor, doing snatches from the floor, and catching the hole and hold stable overhead and do all these things, and they can train full range of motion back squats, they can train full range of motion front squats, that'll carry over to heavy pulls. That'll carry over to heavy squats. That'll carry over to heavy partial movements. But if you're constantly just training that partial movement, it won't carry over to the full range. So you have to sit there and think too, what's the transfer of training? What is the optimal for, you know, increasing the length of the muscles, teaching the nervous system how to recruit as many motor units as possible, and then teaching the body how to decelerate as quickly as possible. That's how you throw far, and by training full range of motion lifts, that's how you learn. Feel a little more pumped. A little more, or what was?